In medieval England, justice wasn't just served, it was staged. And the main act? Public executions. From William the Conqueror to Henry VIII, English monarchs treated executions as the proof of their divine right, a public display of sacred authority. Courts, like the infamous Star Chamber, enforced that will. And the church didn't just nod along, it backed them. What the church did beyond that, we'll come back to it. No one was truly safe from medieval justice, but nobles did get leniency. They weren't sent to the gallows. That was for murderers and common thieves. And nobles certainly didn't burn at the stake. Burning was reserved for heretics, servants who killed their masters, or wives who killed their husbands, among others. Nobles expected a beheading and felt entitled to it. Weird? Yes, but that was medieval England. There were other punishments too, like being gutted like a fish, kept for heinous offenses. Like the rest, they were meant to keep people in line. It worked, mostly. No one wanted to be cut open alive. No one wanted to be the person a church priest declared was dying as penance for sins. Priests would even try to save the condemned soul from eternal punishment. But the church didn't stop at ritual. It actively sanctioned penalties, and its go-to public execution was burning, reserved for heretics and witches. So executions weren't just state control. They were religious ritual too. You saw them across medieval Europe, but England's spin was especially extreme. They loved the theatrics, staging executions where the most people could watch. And beyond the hangings common across Europe, the English leaned into uniquely grim ideas. Boiling alive, basically slow cooking a person to death, and pressing to death. Their monarchs were inventive. It was graphic and horrifying, and most of the time, the crowd enjoyed it. But the people did more than enjoy. We'll elaborate on that in the next part of the video. Be warned. Next, we're diving into the different execution methods, how they worked, the crimes that triggered them, and notorious cases. This is not for the faint-hearted. The first will make your heart boil. Richard Rose was a cook in the household of John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester. His master was a fierce critic of some of Henry VIII's decisions. Richard didn't concern himself with politics. His job was simple: cook meals that nourished his master. In 1531, he made a killer meal. John ate with his servants, but instead of patting his stomach, he doubled over in agony and fell sick. 2 servants died and others got ill. Richard was accused of poisoning and soon convicted, even though there wasn't clear evidence he was the actual poisoner. It looked like he was the scapegoat. Richard knew death was coming. He didn't expect this. Henry was furious. He and Parliament called poisoning an act of cowardice and high treason. They knew it could happen to any of them, and to prevent that, something had to be done. Henry had a philosophy. The punishment should fit the crime. Hanging an alleged poisoner didn't fit, so he decided that if a cook murdered by poison, the cook should be cooked alive. Cruel? Yes, but to Henry, no crueler than poison. And seeing someone boiled alive might make any would-be assassin rethink. Parliament passed the Act for Poisoning, declared poisoning a form of high treason, punishable by boiling, and then applied it retroactively to Richard. On the day of the execution, the crowd gathered at Smithfield. They didn't know what to expect. It was the first time many would witness this punishment. Their hearts were already hard. They had seen everything. This would be no different. They were wrong. A large cauldron bubbled with boiling water. Richard was plunged in. As the water hit his skin, a deathly scream tore from his throat and pierced even hardened hearts. Some wept. Others covered their ears. A few muttered that Henry VIII had gone too far. The crowd that usually treated executions like entertainment was horrified. They wanted it to stop. It was only beginning. With boiling, the executioner had 2 options. He could plunge the offender into water, or sometimes hot oil, and cook them. Or, if the monarch wanted the screams to last, the offender would be dunked repeatedly, drawn out to prolong the suffering. Henry wanted Richard's suffering prolonged. Richard was dunked again and again. His torment extended, and eventually he was left to cook until his flesh fell from his bones like a slowly cooked lamb. With his death, a new form of terror spread. The punishment was so horrific that in 1537 it was abolished. But medieval England wasn't done. There were other dreadful methods. And the next one didn't start with a sentence. It started with silence. Pressing to death. Silence as resistance. Outside medieval England, pressing to death wasn't a public spectacle. It happened in dungeons or cells. The English, though, had a flair for the dramatic. And while this form of public punishment wasn't technically a formal execution, it was no less brutal. In capital cases, entering a plea, guilty or not guilty, was crucial. Sometimes offenders stood mute and refused to plead, and they often had good reasons. The Crown hated it. Silence was resistance, and they would crush it, or in this case, press it. Imagine a watermelon slowly pressed beneath an elephant's foot. It cracks, then bursts. Here, the watermelon is a person. The foot is a stack of heavy weights. The person was laid flat on their back. A heavy wooden board, even a door, was placed on top. At this point, they knew what was coming, and they could stop it by pleading guilty or not guilty. Still, some wouldn't. Large stones or iron weights were added one by one. Discomfort turned to agony, and that wasn't the worst of it. At any moment, they could end it with a plea, but they refused. One man even shouted for more weight until he died. Death could take about an hour. It wasn't just pain, it was hell. Ribs cracked. A shard could pierce an organ. Lungs stopped pulling air. The chest wouldn't rise. The heart compressed, then slowly exploded under the pressure. Many died sooner, from internal bleeding or simple suffocation. This was Margaret Clitheroe's fate on March 25, 1586. A Catholic convert living in York, she ran afoul of Queen Elizabeth I's crackdown on Catholics. Elizabeth was enforcing Protestant reforms, and according to the Crown, Margaret, a butcher's wife, defied the law and committed treason. She was accused of housing Catholic priests and told to plead. She refused. On March 25, 1586, before a crowd at the toll booth near Ouse Bridge, Margaret was laid on the ground. She saw something familiar, the door to her house. It was placed on her. Then, stones, about 800 pounds, were stacked on the door. Her ribs crushed. She couldn't breathe. She kept praying. She didn't plead. She had a reason, and so did others who chose pressing over a plea. In those days, if someone pleaded and then died after being found guilty of a capital offense, the Crown could seize their estate. To prevent that, some endured pressing so their property could pass to their children. To them, that pain was small compared to the suffering their families might endure after losing everything. Pressing tested a person's will and broke it, but the next punishments had a single goal: utter destruction. Utter destruction had a name in medieval England: hanging, drawing, and quartering. By 1351, it was law, the ultimate English horror, reserved for men convicted of treasonable offenses. Women were burned at the stake instead, supposedly to spare the public indecency. Some save, that was. The ritual was so severe it made even the strongest-willed beg for death, not mercy. Stage 1 began with the drawing to the gallows. The prisoner was tied to a sled and dragged by a horse from prison to the execution site while people hurled insults, human waste, rotten food, anything they could grab. That was William Wallace's treatment on his way to the gallows in 1305. Hugh Despenser the Younger, once a favorite of Edward II and accused in 1326 of sowing disputes between the king and queen, endured the same. So did Guy Fawkes, the gunpowder plot conspirator who planned to blow up Parliament in 1606. When the Crown wanted maximum humiliation, they stripped prisoners naked, killing their shame before the rope did the rest. At the gallows, the prisoner was hanged, but not allowed to die. With the crowd watching and cheering, the body danced in the air as the noose choked the life out. Then, right before death or blacking out, the executioner cut them down. A few were lucky, slipping into unconsciousness and dying here. Not all deaths came from the rope, though. Guy Fawkes begged the hangman to let him die. Instead, he was cut down at the brink. Knowing what came next, he dived headfirst from the scaffold, snapping his neck and dying instantly. What could be so terrifying that a man would choose that? Fire was the next sight, not for the whole body, but for what was about to be removed. After William and Hugh Despenser were hanged and cut down, they knew what was coming, but knowledge didn't soften the blow. The executioner's knife hovered over their genitals, then, like a butcher at his block, sliced them off. As screams tore across the ground, the blade returned. In a practiced motion, he opened the belly, like a hot knife through butter, and pulled out the intestines, throwing entrails and genitals into the fire while the condemned watched, if they were still conscious. The crowd, by now, was animated with excitement, and the play still had acts left. Whether the prisoner was dying or already dead,
Robert II may have chosen death by burning because this heresy was seen as akin to treason.
the beheading came next. The body was dragged to the block, a trail of blood from belly and groin, and the head was chopped off. Compared to what William and Hugh faced, Guy's self-broken neck was mercy, but even death didn't end it. The final stage was quartering, the body cut into 4 parts. Sometimes each limb was tied to 4 horses, driven in different directions until the body tore apart. Then came the display. After William Wallace was quartered, his parts were sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, towns in England and Scotland where his rebellion had been popular. The message was simple: resistance is futile. It didn't stop people from resisting, which brings us to the next punishment. Burning at the stake, heresy, petty treason, and public purging. If hanging, drawing, and quartering was utter destruction, burning was the public purging. Under the Treason Act of 1351, when women were traitors, they were burned at the stake. But it didn't stop there. Women who killed their husbands, like Margaret Clitheroe in 1378, who allegedly conspired with her lover, fed the flames too. Servants who killed their masters, not the gallows like men who did the same, the fire. If a woman counterfeited coin, she went straight to the stake. A man for the same crime was hanged, and that was it. Unfair? Absolutely. But the church supported it, even justified it for sorcery or witchcraft, accusations that fell mostly on women. There were exceptions, though. Men were burned as well, for heresy. In Oxford in 1555, Bishops Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley were burned together for Protestant heresy. Even as the flames rose, they showed astonishing will. Like other public executions, this was meant to scare people into obedience. Yet given how many were burned, it clearly didn't work the way the Crown hoped. Here's how it played out. The prisoner was tied to a wooden stake. Flammable materials were piled around them. The executioner lit the heap. Thick smoke wrapped the victim. Then came the burning. The wail that followed stayed with anyone who heard it. Sometimes the smoke would choke a person before the fire truly took hold, and executioners hated that. They wanted pain and suffering on display, so they started using green wood or damp fuel. Less flame, more smoke and heat, a slow burn. The condemned would feel every second as the temperature climbed until they were roasted alive like pigs on a spit. There was mercy of a sort. The hangman couldn't free anyone, but he could strangle the condemned as the fire was lit, so they died before the flames cooked them. Other times he tied a bag of gunpowder around the neck or waist. That's what happened to the Protestant martyr Anne Askew, burned in 1546 for heresy. If the flames reached the gunpowder, the explosion brought a quicker death. It wasn't much of a mercy, but compared to what's coming next, it might be the kindest ending on offer. Other and informal methods. Just as burning at the stake was mostly reserved for women, the ordeal by water targeted them too. It wasn't codified the way burning was. It was mostly a mob thing. And here's the irony. The same public that sometimes recoiled at boiling or burning could be active participants in punishments like this. Before burning became the standard for women accused of witchcraft, the ordeal by water was the test. From today's perspective, the logic was beyond silly. People would throw a woman suspected of sorcery into water blessed by a priest. If she sank, she wasn't a witch, but she might drown anyway, making her innocence pointless. If she floated, that proved she was a witch, and she'd be executed by some other method. The Crown sometimes even called these mob drownings murder, but that didn't stop people from taking the law into their own hands. They found other ways to punish with water too. Creative, if you can call it that. Even when the reasoning was a little wacky. Enter the ducking stool. Not the Crown, not the church, the mob. A woman was strapped to a chair over a pond and dunked again and again to test for witches. Accidents were common. Sometimes they held her under too long. Other times the rope snapped, and into the pond she went. The mob's creativity didn't stop at water. In 1450, Jack Cade led rebels into London to protest corruption and taxes under Henry VI. They beheaded royal officials, including the Crown's Lord Treasurer, and paraded the heads on pikes, with glee. And that was tame compared to what had happened centuries earlier at Clifford's Tower. At that time, Jews were targeted. Debtors didn't want to repay loans, and the crusade was at its peak. Seeking safety, Jews ran into Clifford's Tower. It was a tragic mistake. The mob lit the tower, trapping those inside between flames and murderous arms outside. About 150 chose to die in the fire. The others ran out and were massacred. Gruesome, but at least those victims died quickly. The same can't be said for those condemned to the breaking on the wheel. This punishment wasn't a European one, but medieval England practiced it on the condemned. Hardly surprising given how much brutality they already dealt out. The executioner dragged prisoners to a large wheel and strapped them down. Then, with cold focus, he broke the limbs one by one and left them on the wheel. For days, the prisoner lingered in agony while birds pecked at them, until death finally came. It was rare in England. They preferred quartering, and this next punishment shares something in common with quartering. Beheading, the noble death, when it went right, or very, very wrong. Nobles weren't supposed to be quartered, hanged, or burned. Those punishments were beneath their rank. So the crown offered a cleaner mercy, the sword or the axe. Quick, simple, dignified, at least that was the idea. Executioners used two-handed swords or heavy axes. In England, the axe was king, but the weapon wasn't what mattered. Technique was. Head on the block, neck exposed, the expert aimed for the gap between the second and third cervical vertebrae. Hit it clean, and it was over in a heartbeat. 1536 proved how perfect it could look. Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's second queen, condemned for adultery, incest, and treason. Her swordsman was so precise that onlookers swore her lips still moved in prayer after the blow. But skill cut both ways. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, met a very different end. First swing, his head stayed on. Second swing, still attached. A third, a fourth, a fifth. The executioner mauled his skull before finally finishing the job. Mercy had turned to horror. Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, last of the Plantagenets, fared no better. Accused of Catholic rebellion, she was driven to the block, and her killer hacked at her like a log. 10 blows before it was done. The difference between Anne's moment and theirs? Skill. In untrained hands, noble mercy dissolved into a spectacle of mis-aimed strikes, into skull, shoulder, or back, one swing becoming many. In that moment, even a noble might have wished for the gallows. Section 7. Hanging, the common man's death. For the commoner, thief, housebreaker, highwayman, murderer, the sentence was simple: hanging, until the life bled out. Medieval England saw so many hangings that they became ritual. From Newgate Prison, the condemned jolted by cart to the Tyburn tree, a triangular gallows built to kill many at once. Crowds jeered. At Tyburn, a last prayer or a few final words. Then the drop. But this wasn't the swift neck snap of later times. Medieval hanging was slow strangulation, designed to hurt. Two favorite methods. The cart method, the noose fixed to the beam, the prisoner standing in a cart, and the cart pulled away, leaving the body to writhe and choke. The latter method, worse in some ways. The condemned climbed the ladder themselves. The hangman kicked it out. The victim's legs scissored and kicked at empty air. 5, 10, 15 minutes, eyes bulging, feet drumming the dirt. The crowd watched, and the lesson didn't end with death. Bodies were caged in iron gibbets and hung for all to see, rotting in public view. Sometimes officials even preserved the remains, stretching the warning across months. Still, people rebelled. In 1381, Wat Tyler led a mass rising against taxes. Rebels stormed London and took head. The royal response was swift. More than 1,500 arrests, many hangings, bodies gibbeted as cold proof of the crown's power. Mercy for nobles, the rope for everyone else. and for both the same message: obey or be the spectacle.